So I'm joined today by Dr. Ryan Rhodes, also my husband, who is a professor in health psychology and focuses his research on understanding behavior change, particularly as it relates to health. So he's here to shed a little knowledge around just that. We hear that a lot in Radiant Effect of people who have questions, and we hear, I just have to make it a habit, and I want to change, but I just don't have the motivation, and all of those things that are probably familiar and you've heard before or have said before yourself. So we're here to learn a little bit more about what research suggests are the best techniques and how we can put that into practice. So thanks for being here.
Well, thanks for inviting me on. It's nice to be able to take a bit of a break from writing on the computer and be able to chat about this. Surprisingly, we actually don't talk about behavior change that much, considering we're hanging out all the time.
Yeah, it's the occasional dinner conversation, but not too often.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So maybe we could just start, people describe so often that behavior change is something that's really challenging. Like, we are told time and time again that, exercising is good for us. We should eat more vegetables. We want to have some mindfulness time. And these are really hard things to do. So knowing that, can you speak a little bit to sort of the tenets of behavior change, what creates positive behavior change, and what tools can we implement to maximize success?
Yeah, so we'll start with a really easy question, right? So in psychology, there's over 100 different models trying to answer this question, and not any of them, they're not perfect. And then in terms of techniques for behavior change, we have at least 100 of those as well. So it's a complex question. In our lab at the University of Victoria, we tend to look at behavior change with three kind of layered processes. The first is around what you were speaking to, motivation. So this is trying to get at the energizing effects, a sense of capability to be able to do the behavior. And then we look at a couple of other layers on top of this. So once you have some motivation or some interest, often even with the intention to start, we look at self-regulatory skills. So how can we keep ourselves on track, independent of motivation? Just what are the skills to help us do anything? And how can we improve those and maximize those? And then the last layer we're particularly interested in, and you've kind of mentioned habit, which is one part of this, and that would be reflexive type motivation. So this idea that you don't always have to think about it and want it. You start to become more reflexive in what you're doing. It starts to become more impulsive and more simplistic around stimulus and response.
And that would be like longer term adherence.
Yeah, right? So when we think of these layers, they also have a bit of a longitudinal effect to them. So, you would start, we kind of describe it as a triangle. So at the base of the triangle is going to be motivation. That's your foundation. You have to build, some motivation. And then in that middle layer is around self-regulation skills. And then the last layer, the all-important one, once you start to sustain a behavior, is that reflexive aspect.
And so, you could probably get into a lot of detail about each of these levels of the triangle. But what are your top tips in terms of that motivation piece, in terms of those skills to enact that behavior, and then in terms of the reflexive nature?
Yeah, as you point out, it's complicated, but for very straightforward and probably the most effective tips. Tip number one is spend the time to find something that you find, at least that you find pleasant. If you can find some joy in it, it's going to be even more powerful. If we know something's good for us, but we're ultimately doing a behavior we're just not into at all, it's going to be incredibly hard to stick to it, no matter how skilled you are at self-regulation. And it's going to be very hard to form things like habits around that. So the first tip would be spend the time, take the time to try and look at different behaviors and different approaches to figure out what you actually find palatable and pleasant. And this may be a little bit of snacking on different types of activities for a bit before you settle in on something. The second tip would be, once you've got something you think you might be able to enjoy, or at least to find pleasant, start making a detailed plan. We know from research that just today's the day I'm going to make that change is not sufficient. We really have to schedule it like any other appointment in life. And the more detail we make within our plan, how are we going to do this? What are we going to do? When are we going to do it? If something comes up, what are we going to do about that so that we can reschedule? The more detail we have in our plans, it serves for two purposes. First of all, it helps create a reality to getting the behavior done in the backdrop of all the other things that we do in our days and our lives. And the other is there's some interesting research in neuroscience to suggest that it actually starts to create some cues in your brain about when to perform a behavior. So if we've scheduled it for 3 o'clock on Monday, that cue starts to become ingrained in your brain that you're more likely to actually start to do it at 3 o'clock on Monday. So we have some evidence around that. And then the last tip would be about monitoring behavior. We know that self-monitoring and staying on it and having a way to track it helps to keep it on the radar. So a lot of our best of intentions are often, we start things and then we just kind of lose the plot on it a bit. And some of that is because we have all kinds of other things we're trying to do. So self-monitoring is really important, particularly for new behaviors. It's so easy to slip back into all the things we typically do, all our so-called either bad habits or just other types of behaviors that have become normal to us.
And so would monitoring be like tracking it, using things like, if we're talking about activity, things like Fitbit, but also maybe having like an accountability buddy or health coaches, like people that can kind of guide you on that path and be there as your kind of cheerleaders?
Yeah, it's a great point about bringing out all the different dimensions of monitoring, because it can be any of those. Something like having a coach or somebody to be able to chat about with these things is even more powerful than a tracker or a diary. But all of these are forms of being able to monitor your behavior. And, related to monitoring, it allows us to reset at times too. So when we're actually monitoring our behavior, we can reset our goals. If our goals are too vast or not specific enough or not difficult enough or too difficult, we really don't know that until we've monitored. So these things work, the planning and the monitoring work together.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so far our tips are find something that you enjoy, or at least it's palatable.
Yes.
Yeah, and so that can be like going to the buffet, so to speak, and trying the different things and saying, this works, this doesn't, I like this, I like being in a class, I like being outside, I like doing it on my own, whatever.
Yeah.
Try all the things.
And I think that's important because a lot of people, if we think of something like New Year's resolutions, a lot of people just try the same thing again. And, right. Why would we be surprised that, if you, and I don't mean to pick on the gym, but if you went to the gym last year and you didn't like it, why do you think that that's going to be successful this time? It's the same type of experience. So snacking on different types of experiences is a really important thing.
And if you don't know, if you're like lost at the buffet, reach out to us, because we've got a lot of ideas, and that's where getting in community can be really helpful too, right? Because it could be like, have you tried this? And you're like, oh no, I haven't. So it helps you kind of expand the box of ideas.
Oh, for sure. Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. So that's tip number 1. Tip number 2 is make a really detailed plan.
Yes.
So with contingency plans.
Yeah.
Because we'll talk about barriers in a minute. And then number 3 is sustaining it.
Yeah.
Right?
Tracking and monitoring. Yeah. And I think we'll talk about habits in a bit, but those are very important factors.
Okay. So sort of building into that idea of a plan, like we hear a lot of different deterrents, barriers, of why things aren't going as planned. I think one of the biggest is I don't have the time. We hear about like, I know what to do, I just don't feel motivated. Like I can't kind of get myself up off the couch. I'm tired. Yeah, can you speak to some of those barriers, and then how can we overcome those? Like what needs to shift?
Right. Yeah, I mean, again, very challenging, but common barriers are the ones you've already brought up. Certainly, how to deal with low motivation, and we've kind of chatted a little bit about that. How to deal with time. Time is a very interesting factor in life, because we often will say, I don't have time, but what a lot of people mean in health behavior is with the time I have, that's not what I want to do. So we're back to motivation.
Because I have time to watch one more episode of Netflix.
Exactly. And we're all on the same 24-hour clock. Now, we do have barriers. That's not to say we don't have barriers and things that are vying for our attention, and priorities that are very important and sometimes more important than our personal health behaviors. But it's important to start reframing around priorities rather than barriers. And what we find is that there's an important shift, as you kind of alluded to, as you start engaging in something like physical activity or healthy eating, that we start to move away from that thinking of barriers to more around how valued this priority is. And so that helps us to recognize, even under limited time, or even when one's tired, you can understand that, you can feel that way, but you know that this is the valued choice to make.
And so, we will hear from a lot of people like, no, I prioritize that. Like, it is of priority to me, but then it doesn't happen. So, in some ways it's like the actual behavior is not congruent with the belief process of it being a priority. But if someone is struggling with that, like feeling that disconnection, do you have any tips of like how to try to reconcile that?
How to reconcile the notion of priorities versus engaging in it?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, that's, again, another challenging thing. I mean, I think in some ways that brings us to the concept
just full of challenging questions.
Of habits. Yeah,
Right.
you are. You're full of challenging questions. But, I think the concept of habit is an interesting one. So, habit gets thrown around as a term colloquially to mean like a pattern of behavior. But in psychology, it's actually very specific psychological construct. It's a cue-driven stimulus toward a behavior. So it's cue-driven motivation, usually below one's awareness. So habits, and we can all think of various habits we have. For anyone who drives a car, they often, will know you plan to go somewhere and you're so habitual with how you drive that, often if there's something new, you'll find that you've gone to your place and forgotten to go in that direction. It's automatized. And so the potential benefit to habituating health behaviors is that it won't require as much motivation over time. So if you're struggling with motivation and you start to habituate it, at least you've got this additional driving force. The way to create habits is interesting. It tends to be through patterned behavior with a stimulus. So one has to practice consistently. So this might be another tip in terms if there's some struggle around sticking to a health behavior, start practicing the health behavior with consistency. So the same type of cues are coming up. One of the best cues might be time of day, because time of day is only coming up once a day. So you can cue that behavior to say 5 o'clock. The other way is to time it with something you only do maybe once a day or once every couple of days, and then it can happen after that. So, as an example, an after dinner walk, or after your morning coffee, you'll do your exercise or something like that. And so that helps tie to that stimulus. If you have other habits, you might be able to say, well, maybe I can fit this into a habit chain. That's another way to look at it, is that we can chain our habits because they start to work together in tandem.
What would be an example of that?
So morning coffee is a great example, right? And also even mealtime preparation and things like that. So, but it's different for everybody. So it's, I certainly encourage anyone when they're thinking of habits to think of what they do in their day that's quite ritualistic and how they might be able to tag it. That also makes sense for something like physical activity or healthy eating. But I think that that's an important way that if you can start to habituate an activity, it helps counter some of the negative motivation that, the struggles with motivation, because it starts to become just a natural impulse that, oh, this is what I need to do. This is how this feels right. It feels natural.
And we hear like all sorts of things about habits. Like I think, I've seen it takes 21 days to make a habit. I've seen it takes like 128 days to make a habit. There's the whole range. So what's the truth in that?
Well, the truth in it is it really depends on the behavior. Okay, so it can take as many days, or sometimes people can't habituate it. So I can sort of speak to the foundation. As I said, consistency is going to be important. But the difficulty of the behavior is going to kick in as well. So the habit, for example, of turning off a light switch when you're leaving a room is quite straightforward. It's a very simple behavior. There's usually not a lot of motivational flux. You're not really, saying, oh, I really don't want to turn off that light switch. And so it's very easy to habituate something like that. But healthy eating and physical activity are complex behaviors, and so they do take more time. What we've found in our research is that it's for something like physical activity, it's about 6 weeks, 4 times a week. That's about that time. But you also, again, it comes back to that motivational foundation that we started with, that you do have to find the behavior at least pleasant. It's almost impossible to habituate a behavior that you dread because you'll be thinking about it. And so with habits, of course, these are sort of less mindful activities that we just start to feel become natural.
Okay. That's helpful. Yeah, I think too, well, then from there, how does the drop off happen? Like we see that with like New Year's resolutions, right? And maybe someone is like going to the gym as an example, for 6 weeks, 4 times a week, but then they just disappear. Like what's going on there?
Well, technically, if you've started to form a habit, you're less likely to drop off. Okay. But in our studies, we've shown that not everyone has the ingredients to form a habit, and one of them is that motivational base we spoke about. So trying to continue to do something you just don't find very satisfying, eventually you'll find a way out of it. So that's really important. And I think that's going on regularly for many people. But yeah, there's certainly a large drop-off, but it's actually often sooner than 6 weeks, to be honest. We find that it drops, there's about the intention-behavior gap, if they call it, where you have the best of intentions and then fall flat, can occur as quickly as a week, but often within 2 weeks. So that's why, in some ways, things like New Year's resolutions have become a bit of a meme, because they're almost destined to fail. They're not. You still need an intention to do something, but really paying attention to some of the stuff we've been talking about is important.
Mm-hmm. And then, at Radiant Effect for us, obviously the community aspect is really important. And so having connection in our group classes and connection here within our members and the broader community, that's something that is really, really important to us. And so can you speak to how connection and community can play a role in people's success?
Yeah, it's a great point. It actually, community and social connection will play a role at all 3 levels of that pyramid that we were talking about right from the beginning. So if you think of it from a motivational perspective, the many health behaviors in themselves are not all that palatable or fun. But being with people and sharing things with people is often a driver into itself. And in fact, the need to relate to others is a fundamental human need. So involving community and the social aspect is very important to even fostering motivation. It adds that extra oomph to why you want to show up and why you want to do something. Then on that second layer, on that sort of self-regulation, community will offer other people to help you through tough times. So they allow you to have that extra commitment or somebody to check in with you, to monitor, as you pointed out. So it can be that extra layer of self-regulation beyond just yourself having to drive all the time around health behaviors like physical activity or healthy eating. And then community can also be a cue with habits. It can be a cue around identity, around being able to say, this is who I am now, I'm part of something, which is another powerful sort of what we call reflexive motivational system. And so community is important across all aspects, from the adoption of a behavior all the way to long-term sustainability. And we've shown this in many studies in exercise science over the years, the importance of a social community.
Amazing. So if you're here, you're in the right place, right?
For sure.
Yeah. Okay. So maybe to finish, just what would be your words of advice to someone who is struggling with this, who wants to make a change, even has a good sense of what they want to do, but just can't seem to get started? What would be like your one piece of advice?
Yeah. So a couple of related pieces of advice on this. So one is to recognize that most of what we're talking about self-improvement and health behaviors, it's a journey. It's a lifelong journey. And so related to that is to try to not think in terms of crystallized on and off or failure and success, that any little bit makes a difference. And if you were feeling like not doing something and you even just said, well, I'm going to do 10 minutes of something in terms of physical activity, or I'm going to eat that extra vegetable, or, that's all a win, because it's all a win across the journey. And so try not to think in terms of sort of a crystallized on and off kind of routine, because that's not how these behaviors work. And we're all going to have times where things aren't going to work. But it's about being able to sort of rally and do one little thing on those tough days. That's what actually makes the difference across time.
So that idea of like, just get started. It doesn't have to be perfect. It doesn't have to be a lot.
Yeah. And those are the great days where you're tested, and if just doing a little bit, that shows that you're still staying on track, and it doesn't have to be perfect at all. Amazing.
Okay. Well, thank you. I think this is really helpful, and it gives people some really great tips. We'll summarize and link some of these top tips in the comments, and if you do have questions, feel free to pop them in the comments, and I can get them answered for you. So thank you. Yeah, thanks for joining us, and thank you for being here and listening, and you can do it. Just get started. That's the message today.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and do it in community. It's helpful. Okay.
All right. Thank you.
Have a great day, everybody.